My husband didn't just sign the divorce papers, he signed away my sanity in a crowded courtroom, calling my trauma, instability, and my service a liability. He took my daughter, my career, and the sky I once owned, leaving me with nothing but the deafening silence of a Wyoming winter. They told me I was broken, a ghost that didn't know how to haunt anymore. But when the Pentagon's black SUV pulled into my driveway, I realized the world hadn't forgotten Reaper Zero. They just waited until they were desperate enough to summon a woman they'd already tried to bury. My husband didn't just sign the divorce papers, he signed away my sanity in a crowded courtroom, calling my trauma, instability, and my service a liability. He took my daughter, my career, and the sky I once owned, leaving me with nothing but the deafening silence of a Wyoming winter. They told me I was broken, a ghost that didn't know how to haunt anymore. But when the Pentagon's black SUV pulled into my driveway, I realized the world hadn't forgotten Reaper Zero. They just waited until they were desperate enough to summon a woman they'd already tried to bury. The Wyoming wind doesn't just blow, it screams. It claws at the cedar siding of my ranch house like it's trying to remind me that out here, nature doesn't care about your medals or your past. I stood in the middle of my garage, the air thick with the smell of old grease, diesel, and cedar smoke. It's a scent that grounds me. A scent that doesn't smell like jet fuel or burning rubber. My hands were stained dark with oil, the grit settled deep into the creases of my palms. I was elbow-deep in the engine of a 1978 John Deere tractor, a machine as stubborn and worn out as I felt. Every turn of the wrench required a specific kind of violence, a calculated force. It's the only thing that keeps the nightmares at bay, focusing on the tangible, the mechanical, the things I can actually fix with my own two hands. In the courtroom, my husband's lawyer had used those hands against me. He called them trembling. He said they weren't fit to hold a child because they had spent too many hours clenching a flight stick in the middle of a war zone. The judge believed him. Now those same hands were all I had left. I looked over at the workbench, where a single, tattered teddy bear sat next to a stack of legal documents. The bear belonged to my daughter, Maya. The documents belonged to the state, decreeing that I was a psychological risk. I wiped my brow with the back of a greasy sleeve and leaned against the cold metal of the tractor. The silence of the valley was heavy, thick enough to hear the rhythm of my own pulse. I hated it. Silence in the air meant an engine had failed. Silence on the ground meant someone was lurking. I turned my gaze to the highest shelf in the garage. There, sitting in a protective case I'd built myself, was my old flight helmet. The visor was etched with fine, spiderweb scratches, battle scars from 100 missions in the Korengal Valley. Most people see a piece of equipment. I see the faces of the men I pulled out of the dirt. I see the tracer fire. I see the moment the world went sideways. My fingers went to the pocket of my canvas work coat, brushing against a small, hard object. My father's silver ring. He was a mechanic for the Air Force, long before I ever thought about flying. He used to tell me that precision wasn't just a skill, it was a form of respect. If you're precise, you're honest. If you're honest, you survive. I've tried to be precise my whole life, but somehow, I still ended up crashed and burned on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. A flash of movement caught my eye. Down the long, gravel driveway that cut through the snow, a black SUV was kicking up a trail of white powder. It moved with a terrifying kind of purpose. Out here, nobody visits without a phone call first, not unless they're lost or they're looking for trouble. I didn't move, I just watched it. The vehicle stopped 20 yards from the garage door, its engine idling with a low, predatory hum. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a dark overcoat, but the posture was unmistakable, shoulders back, chin level, military. He didn't say a word as he walked toward me. He just held out a manila envelope with a red top secret stamp bleeding through the paper. Commander Thorne, he said. His voice was flat, professional. I'm a ranch hand now, I replied, my voice raspy from disuse. And the court says I'm unfit for duty. You're at the wrong house. The Navy doesn't care what a civilian judge thinks, he said, stepping closer. There's a tactical gap in the joint training program at Norfolk. The Admiral requested the best search and rescue strategist left on the books. That's you. I looked at the envelope. I could see the Norfolk Naval Base return address. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. Norfolk was a world away from the peace I'd tried to build here. It was a world of steel, egos, and ghosts. Who's the Admiral? I asked, my grip tightening on the wrench. Silas Vane, he answered. The name hit me like a physical blow. Silas Vane, the man who had spent the last 8 years making sure my name was dragged through the mud of every after-action report. The man who believed I was the reason his brother never came home from the mountains. I looked back at the tractor, then at the empty house behind me where my daughter's room sat frozen in time. I was a woman with nothing left to lose, and apparently, the man who hated me most was the only one offering me a way back into the sky. I reached out and took the envelope. The paper was cold. I'll need an hour to pack, I said. I walked to the shelf and grabbed my helmet. I didn't look back at the ranch. I didn't look at the divorce papers on the table. I just felt the weight of the silver ring in my pocket, and the sudden, sharp clarity that the silence was finally over. The storm wasn't coming for me anymore. I was going to meet it. The transition from the hollow silence of Wyoming to the mechanical roar of Norfolk Naval Base felt like a punch to the gut. One day I was breathing in the scent of frozen cedar and diesel. The next, I was inhaling salt air, jet fuel, and the heavy, metallic tang of an empire at work. Norfolk is a monster. It's a city of steel, a place where the horizon isn't a mountain range, but the towering gray silhouettes of Ford-class aircraft carriers. They sat in the docks like sleeping giants, their flight decks vast enough to hold 1,000 secrets. The air here moved differently. It vibrated. The scream of F-35s tearing through the clouds above wasn't just noise. It was a constant, aggressive reminder of where I was. I felt out of place in my stiff, newly issued uniform. It felt like a costume compared to the grease-stained canvas I'd worn for months. My back ached, a lingering gift from a decade of slamming helicopters into mountain ridges. And the humidity of the Virginia coast made every old injury throb in time with the base's pulse. I navigated the labyrinth of concrete and high-security gates, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes. In the military, word travels faster than a Mach 2 interceptor. People knew. They knew about the divorce, the court cases, and the instability label. They saw a woman who had been grounded by her own life, trying to walk back into the lion's den. The headquarters building was a monolith of glass and stone. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from the chaotic energy of the docks to the suffocating, air-conditioned stillness of high-level command. Every floorboard seemed to demand a specific kind of step. Every salute I returned felt like a test I was barely passing. I reached the top floor, the E-ring of the base, where the air smelled of expensive floor wax and old, inherited power. I stood outside the heavy oak door of the Admiral's office, my hand hovering over the wood. My father's silver ring was a cold pressure against my skin through the fabric of my pocket. Precision, I reminded myself, precision is honesty. I knocked once, hard. Enter, a voice barked. It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. Admiral Silas Vane sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from the hull of a Victorian warship. He didn't look up. He was a man built of sharp angles and iron-gray hair, his chest a tapestry of ribbons and medals that screamed of a lifetime spent winning. He was the golden boy of the Navy SEALs, a legend who had climbed the ladder by being the most ruthless man in every room. He let me stand there, 1 minute too. The silence wasn't like the peace of Wyoming, it was a weapon. He was letting me know exactly where I stood on his chessboard. "Mrs. Thorne," he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He didn't use my rank, he didn't even look at the file in front of him. "I see you've managed to find your way out of the mountains." "It's Commander Thorne, Admiral," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "And I go where I'm ordered." "Orders," he mused, finally leaning back. His eyes were a piercing, predatory blue. They didn't hold respect, they held a deep, simmering loathing. "A concept you've struggled with in the past, if I recall." But then again, the Air Force always was a bit relaxed about the chain of command. He stood up, his movements fluid and precise, and walked toward the window. "I didn't bring you here to fly. I brought you here because the Pentagon thinks we need a female perspective on our search and rescue integration. Politics, Commander, a game I'm sure you're tired of losing." He turned, and for a split second, his gaze flickered to a framed photograph on his desk. It was a young man, barely 20, with the same sharp jawline and the same defiant spark in his eyes. Julian Vane, Silas's younger brother. The boy who died in a valley while I was in the air. Before I could say a word, Silas reached out and flipped the photo face down with a sudden, violent snap of his wrist. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a gunshot. "You're a logistics consultant now," he snapped, his mask of professional indifference slipping just enough to show the raw, jagged hate underneath. "You'll stay in the annex, you'll review the flight logs. And you will stay out of the way of the men who are actually doing the work. Am I clear?" "Crystal, Admiral," I replied. He didn't dismiss me. He just sat back down and went back to his paperwork, erasing my existence from the room. I walked out, my blood boiling and my skin crawling. I found my assigned office at the very edge of the base, in a prefab building that smelled of damp paper and rust. It was a cubicle in a graveyard of old files. Silas hadn't just brought me back to work, he'd brought me back to bury me in the dark. I sat down at the metal desk and pulled open the top drawer. It was empty, except for a single piece of paper left behind by whoever had occupied this ghost room before me. It was an old flight roster from 8 years ago. My eyes scanned the names until I hit the bottom. There, circled in fading red ink, was a call sign. Reaper 0. My breath hitched. This wasn't an accident. Silas Vane hadn't just called me here to consult. He had set a trap, and I had walked right into the center of it. I looked out the small, grimy window at the gray Atlantic. The Wyoming silence was gone, replaced by the low, steady hum of a war that was just beginning. Silas wanted a ghost to haunt. He was about to find out that some ghosts don't stay in the shadows. The annex office was a tomb. It wasn't just the smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. It was the way the walls seemed to close in on you, papered with the ghosts of failed missions and discarded reports. Silas Vane hadn't just put me in the corner of the base. He'd put me in a cage designed to rot my spirit. Every time I looked out that grimy, salt-crusted window, I watched the young hotshots, pilots with shiny wings and zero scars, walking across the tarmac with a swagger I used to own. They looked at me, if they looked at all, like I was a piece of outdated hardware. A relic of a war they'd only read about in textbooks. I spent my first few days submerged in the mundane. Silas buried me under a mountain of logistics data, hoping the sheer boredom would break me. But he forgot one thing about rescue pilots. We're trained to find the needle in the haystack when the haystack is on fire. I didn't just read the reports, I lived in them. The first person who didn't look through me was Lieutenant Lexi Moore. She was young, sharp, and carried her flight suit like it was a second skin, but there was a tension in her jaw that I recognized immediately. She found me on my fourth night, leaning against the vending machine in a hallway that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the Cold War. "You're Thorne, right?" she asked, her voice low. "The one they brought in from the sticks." "Wyoming, actually," I said, leaning back. "And it's less about the sticks and more about the silence." Lexi didn't smile. She checked the hallway before stepping closer. "Don't get too comfortable in that office. Vane is moving pieces. He's pushing for a high-risk operation in the Middle East. He needs a win to secure his seat at the Pentagon, and word is, he's looking for a fall guy. Or a fall woman, someone he can point to if the bodies start coming home in bags." "I'm just here for the paperwork, Lieutenant," I replied, but my gut was already nodding up. "He doesn't do anything just for paperwork," she whispered. "Watch your back, around here he's a god." But gods are usually the ones who demand the sacrifices. After she left, I couldn't sleep. I went back to that metal desk and fired up the old terminal. The blue light reflected off my father's silver ring as I began to dig. I didn't look at the logistics. I looked for Korengal. I looked for Mission 204. Accessing those files felt like walking through a minefield. The Navy's digital archives are a labyrinth of permissions and firewalls, but Silas had been sloppy. He'd locked the main file, but he'd forgotten about the communication logs in the sub-archives. My heart hammered against my ribs as I bypassed the final encryption layer. There it was. The official report on Julian Vane's death. It was a masterpiece of creative writing. It cited pilot error and delayed extraction response. It painted a picture of a rescue team that hesitated while a hero bled out. It pointed the finger directly at Reaper Zero. But then I found the raw data. The time-stamped flight logs. I leaned closer, my breath hitching. The request for extraction came in at 2:40 hours. Reaper Zero was in the air at 2:42. We didn't delay. We were already moving, before the command was even authorized. The logs showed that we reached the extraction point 5 minutes earlier than the official report stated. We were there. We were hovering over the smoke, while Julian was still alive. So why did the report say we failed? I scrolled down to the tactical commands. There was a direct order from the forward operating base, signed by Silas Vane himself. It was a hold position, order issued to the rescue bird. He'd held us back. He'd kept us circling in the dark, while his brother was on the ground. I sat back in the creaky chair, the cold realization washing over me. Silas didn't hate me because I failed. He hated me because I knew he was the one who hesitated. Or worse, he was the one who gambled with his brother's life for a tactical advantage that never came. Suddenly, a soft rustle at the door made me freeze. I reached for the heavy flashlight on my desk, my muscles tensing. But no one entered. Instead, a thin, white envelope slid under the door, skimming across the linoleum floor. I waited a beat, then lunged for the door and threw it open. The hallway was empty. Only the hum of the fluorescent lights answered me. I picked up the envelope. It wasn't official, no stamps, no logos. Just my name written in a cramped, hurried script. Inside, a single sheet of paper contained a typed sentence that chilled me to the bone. "Don't let him lie to you again. That night the storm wasn't the killer, the command was." I folded the paper and tucked it into my boot. I looked at the terminal, at the digital evidence of a lie 8 years in the making. Silas Vane thought he'd brought me here to finish me off. He thought he could use my broken life as a shield for his own sins. He was wrong. I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I was the ghost that was finally coming out of the shadows. I walked back to my desk, picked up my helmet, and felt the familiar weight of it. The game was no longer about logistics. It was about the truth. And the truth was about to hit Norfolk like a Category 5 hurricane. I wasn't going to hide in this tomb anymore. Tomorrow, I was going to look the Admiral in the eye and show him that Reaper Zero was very, very much alive. The Joint Tactical Briefing Room at Norfolk was a cathedral of glass, steel, and unearned arrogance. It smelled of expensive cologne, ozone from the massive digital displays, and the heavy, suffocating weight of rank. I sat at the very end of the long mahogany table, a ghost in a room full of gods. 40 high-ranking officers, the elite of the Navy and Air Force, were draped over their chairs with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from never having been the one bleeding in the dirt. Admiral Silas Vane stood at the head of the room, a laser pointer in his hand like a scepter. He was in his element. He moved with the practiced grace of a shark, weaving a narrative of a daring new Middle Eastern operation that looked great on a PowerPoint slide, but felt like a suicide mission in reality. He talked about calculated risks and acceptable margins, terms that usually meant men in their 20s were going to die for a line on his resume. I stayed silent. I watched the way he strategically ignored me, his gaze sweeping over my head as if I were part of the furniture. I was the logistics consultant, the woman from Wyoming, the one they brought in to check a box. I felt the paper in my boot, the anonymous warning, pressing against my skin. It was a reminder that I wasn't just an observer. I was a witness to a crime he thought he'd buried 8 years ago. Vane clicked to the final slide, a map of a rugged coastline battered by extreme weather patterns. Now, he said, his voice dripping with a forced, paternal warmth. Since we've spent so much money bringing in an expert on rescue logistics, I'd hate for her talents to go to waste. Mrs. Thorne, why don't you enlighten us? Given a Category 4 storm surge and zero visibility conditions, how would your civilian-minded rescue protocols handle an extraction in Sector 7? Every head in the room turned toward me. Some looked bored, others looked pitying. A few just smirked, waiting for the housewife to stutter over tactical jargon. I didn't stutter. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor with a sharp, jarring screech that cut through the low hum of the air conditioning. I walked toward the display, my father's silver ring cold against my finger. I didn't look at the officers, I looked at the data. Sector 7 is a wind tunnel, I said, my voice flat and carrying a resonance that surprised even me. The thermal updrafts from the cliff face create a vortex that renders standard GPS useless. If you send a bird in there using standard Navy rescue protocols, the rotor wash will bounce off the canyon walls and flip the aircraft before the hoist even clears the door. You don't use a protocol for Sector 7, Admiral. You use a pilot who knows how to read the air, not the manual. The room went dead silent. Silas Vane's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp venom. I'd challenged him, and I'd done it with more precision than his entire staff combined. He needed to put me back in my place. He needed to remind everyone that I was beneath them. Impressive, he said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. You certainly know your way around a textbook. But out here, in the real world, we rely on brotherhood and identity. We rely on the names we earn in the fire. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, his shadow towering over me. Tell me something, sweetheart. All that time you spent playing pilot in the mountains. Did you ever actually earn a call sign? Or did the boys just call you Honeybee when you brought them their coffee? A ripple of laughter surged through the room. It was a wet, ugly sound, the sound of 40 powerful men enjoying the public humiliation of a woman they deemed an intruder. Silas joined in, his chest puffing out, savoring the moment he'd finally broken the relic from Wyoming. I let the laughter swell. I let it reach its peak, echoing off the glass walls. And then I stepped into his space. I leaned in, my face inches from his, until he could see the lack of fear in my eyes. "You want my call sign, Admiral?" I asked. My voice was low, but in the sudden vacuum of silence that followed, it sounded like a crack of thunder. "By all means," he mocked, "enlight the room." "Reaper Zero," I said. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was an absolute vacuum. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a grenade pin is pulled. Across the room, an older captain dropped his pen, the plastic clattering against the table like a gunshot. Two SEAL commanders at the center of the table stood up in one fluid motion, their eyes wide, their faces pale. They knew. Every veteran in that room knew the legend of the Reaper. The pilot who flew into the Korengal mist and came back with a cabin full of the dead and the dying. The pilot who survived the storm that killed the Admiral's brother. Silas Vane didn't just stop laughing. He froze. The color drained from his face, so fast it was like he'd been struck. His hand, still clutching the laser pointer, began to shake. The smug predator was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he'd just seen his own executioner. "Reaper Zero," he whispered, the words barely catching in his throat. "That's right," I said, my voice steady as a heartbeat. "And if you'd spent less time trying to bury the relic, and more time reading the actual mission logs, you'd know that Reaper Zero doesn't miss the mark. She just waits for the right moment to hit it." I didn't wait for a response. I gathered my files, tucked them under my arm, and walked toward the door. 40 pairs of eyes followed me, but none of them were laughing anymore. They looked at me with a mixture of awe and terrifying realization. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the hallway, the cool air hitting my face. I didn't look back. I knew Silas Vane was still standing there, paralyzed, his empire of lies beginning to crack under the weight of two simple words. The joke was over. The Reaper was back, and this time I wasn't just bringing home the bodies, I was bringing the truth. The shockwave from the briefing room hadn't even settled before the retaliation began. Silas Vane didn't survive at the top for decades by playing fair. He survived by crushing anyone who saw the cracks in his armor. Within an hour of my reveal, the consultancy was over. I was ordered to the flight line for a mandatory tactical evaluation. It was a transparent move, a desperate attempt to strip away the legend of Reaper Zero. By proving that the woman behind the name was nothing more than a broken-down relic. The Flight Training Center was a cavernous, high-tech cathedral of glass and steel. It smelled of ozone, hydraulic fluid, and the underlying scent of adrenaline. Silas stood in the elevated glass observation deck, his silhouette backlit by the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked down at me like a Roman emperor watching a gladiator enter the pit. Beside me, Lexi Moore was checking the pre-flight list on a Pave Hawk, her movements jerky and anxious. She knew this wasn't a standard drill. The atmosphere was thick, charged with the kind of electricity you feel right before a lightning strike. "Commander Thorne," Silas's voice boomed over the PA system, cold and distorted by the speakers. "Since you're so fond of reading the air, let's see how you handle a real-world scenario. You'll be conducting a blind landing under maximum electromagnetic interference. No instruments, no ground guidance, just you and the machine. If you can't put it on the mark, you're grounded permanently for safety violations." It was a suicide run. In a modern helicopter, flying without avionics in a simulated storm surge, is like trying to thread a needle while being blindfolded and spun in circles. Lexi looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Ma'am, the specs for this drill are off the charts. He's overclocking the turbulence simulators. It's a setup." "I know," I said, my voice low and steady. I buckled into the pilot's seat, the familiar embrace of the 5-point harness feeling like an old friend. But he forgot one thing, Lexi. The machine doesn't lie, only the people do. As soon as we cleared the tarmac and entered the simulation zone, the world went black. Huge fans roared to life, creating a vortex of artificial wind that slammed into the airframe like a physical fist. Then the sabotage began. I watched the digital cockpit flicker and die. The radar screen hissed into static. The auto-leveling gyros, the very brain of the aircraft, whined and cut out. Silas had done more than just set a difficult task. He'd gutted the bird's nervous system from the control room. The helicopter bucked violently, the nose dipping toward the concrete below. Lexi gasped, her hands hovering near the controls in a panic. "Everything's dead, we're going down." "Hands off, Lieutenant," I barked. "I've got the stick." I closed my eyes. It sounds crazy to anyone who hasn't spent 3,000 hours in a cockpit, but I stopped trying to see. I started to feel. I felt the vibration of the rotor blades in the soles of my boots. I felt the way the airframe tilted through the seat of my pants. This was seat of the pants, flying, the raw primal connection between pilot and gravity. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my father's silver ring. I placed it on the flat surface of the dead instrument panel. As the helicopter tilted, the ring slid. That was my inclinometer. I watched the way the silver caught the dim emergency lights, using the ring's movement to judge our pitch and roll. I wasn't flying a multi-million-dollar piece of Navy hardware anymore. I was flying a collection of metal and physics, just like my father taught me in the garage back in Wyoming. The wind rumbled, a deep guttural growl that shook my teeth. I could hear Silas's breathing over the open comms. He was waiting for the sound of crashing metal. Instead, he got the steady, rhythmic thump of a pilot who refused to die. I adjusted the collective, feeling the lift in my gut. I flared the tail, bleeding off airspeed by the sound of the engine's whine alone. The landing wasn't just soft, it was silent. The skids touched the exact center of the painted bullseye with a gentle click. For a long heartbeat, the only sound was the dying hum of the rotors. The observation deck was dead quiet. I looked up through the glass canopy. Silas was leaning against the railing, his face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. He tried to break the Reaper, and all he'd done was prove why the name existed in the first place. I unbuckled my harness and stepped out onto the tarmac. My legs were a little shaky, but my heart was calm. I looked Lexi more in the eye, and for the first time, I saw a spark of defiance in her own gaze. "He can't kill a legend with a joystick, Lexi," I said, loud enough for the hidden microphones to pick up. I walked away from the scorched simulation pad, leaving Silas Vane alone in his glass tower. He tried to win with technicalities and sabotage, but I'd won with soul. But as I headed toward the locker room, I knew this was just the opening act. He was cornered now, and a cornered man like Silas would eventually stop trying to break my wings and start trying to burn the whole sky down. The real war wasn't on the flight line. It was in the shadows he'd spent 8 years protecting. And I was done waiting for him to move. It was time to go after the one thing he feared more than my call sign, the truth. The humid Virginia night hung over Norfolk like a wet wool blanket, thick with the scent of salt marsh and jet exhaust. After the stunt Silas pulled at the flight center, the base felt different. The air was charged, prickly. I knew I couldn't just sit in that rotted-out annex office and wait for him to drop the next hammer. Silas Vane wasn't just trying to ego-trip me anymore, he was trying to erase me. And a man only tries that hard to bury someone when he's terrified of what they might dig up. I met Lexi Moore behind the dark side of the hangar, away from the sweeping white arcs of the perimeter security lights. She looked pale, her eyes darting toward every passing hum of a Humvee. She was a rising star in the Navy, a pilot with a clean record and a bright future. And here she was, risking it all for a woman the Admiral called a relic. "You sure about this, ma'am?" she whispered, her breath hitching. "If we get caught in the server room, it's not just a slap on the wrist. It's Leavenworth, it's the end of everything." "Everything ended for me a long time ago, Lexi," I said, my voice low and raspy. "But for you, this is about making sure the people you fly with don't end up as footnotes in a liar's memoir. You saw what he did to that bird today. He'd crash us all to save his own seat at the Pentagon." She didn't say another word. She just nodded once, her jaw set in that hard, military line, and led me toward the restricted archives. The walk through the base felt like a mission behind enemy lines. We moved through the shadows, timed our pace to the rhythmic thrum of the security vents, and slipped through the side entrance of the records building. Inside, the silence was absolute, the kind of artificial quiet that only exists in rooms filled with humming servers and cold, recycled air. Lexi's fingers flew over the keyboard at the main terminal. She was using a backdoor override she'd snagged from a tech sergeant months ago. "I'm in," she breathed. "But we've only got a window. Once I hit the deep storage encryption, the system is going to flag a localized maintenance check. We've got maybe 10 minutes before a security team decides to wander in here." "Find mission 204, I said, standing over her shoulder. "Korengal Valley, Operation Bering Ridge." The screen flickered, lines of code cascading down like a digital waterfall. Then a red warning box popped up, "Restricted access, Admiral-level clearance required." "He locked it down," Lexi cursed under her breath. "He's got a digital deadbolt on the whole thing." "Try the raw audio subdirectory," I suggested, my father's silver ring pressing into the palm of my hand as I balled my fist. Officers like Vane always lock the reports because they can be edited. But the raw comms, sometimes they get categorized as technical telemetry. They're harder to track. She clicked through 3 more layers of submenus. Her eyes widened. "Got it, file 204A raw audio, no edits, no timestamps on the modification log." She hit play, and I felt the air leave my lungs. Static filled the room, a jagged, electric hiss that transported me right back into the cockpit of that Pave Hawk 8 years ago. Then through the noise came a voice. It was young, desperate, and cracking under the weight of adrenaline. It was Julian Vane. "Command, this is Falcon 6, we are pinned. The ridge is crawling with insurgents, and the ceiling is dropping fast. Requesting immediate extraction at T-1ECD, a D-1ED9X. Reaper 0 is on station. We can see her lights. Please give us the green light." A beat of silence followed. Then the heavy, unmistakable baritone of Silas Vane cut through the static. He sounded different back then, colder, more calculated, but without the veneer of the statesman. "Negative, Falcon 6. Reaper 0 is ordered to hold at 5,000 feet. The risk to the airframe is too high in this weather. You are to hold position and continue the sweep of the northern ridge. That objective is priority." "Silas, listen to me." Julian's voice was a scream now, drowned out by the staccato rhythm of gunfire in the background. "The ridge is a trap, there is no objective here. If you don't let her drop now, we aren't coming home. Tell her to drop. There was another pause. A long, agonizing stretch of time, where the only sound was the wind howling through Julian's headset. Falcon 6, your request is denied. Reaper 0, stay at altitude. Do not engage, that is a direct order, acknowledge. I remembered that moment. I remembered the way my headset had buzzed with that order, while I stared down through the mist, at the muzzle flashes in the valley below. I remembered the rage I felt when I was forced to orbit like a vulture, while men died. Because an admiral wanted to clear a ridge that didn't matter. Lexi stared at the screen, her hand over her mouth. He killed him, she whispered. He knew it was a trap, and he used his own brother as bait to try and flush out the insurgents for a bigger headline. And when it went south, he blamed you for staying at altitude. He didn't just blame me, Lexi, I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. He turned me into the ghost that haunted his failure. He needed a reaper, so he wouldn't have to look in the mirror and see a murderer. Suddenly, the red light on the terminal began to pulse. Security alert, unauthorized data stream. We have to go, Lexi scrambled, her fingers pulling the encrypted drive from the port. Now. We slipped out the back, just as the heavy thud of boots echoed in the main hallway. We ran through the fog, the damp air sticking to my skin like a second layer of guilt. When we reached the safety of the dark hangar, I took the drive from Lexi's hand. I looked at the small black piece of plastic. It was a bomb. It was enough to level Silas Vane's career, his legacy, and the entire structure of the Navy's command ethics. But as I tucked it into my pocket, I didn't feel the rush of victory. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. Silas hadn't brought me to Norfolk to bury a pilot. He'd brought me here because he was tired of carrying the secret alone. He wanted to destroy the only person who could testify to his sin. I looked up at the Admiral's tower, the lights still burning bright. The storm is here, Silas, I whispered to the dark. And this time, I'm not staying at altitude. I turned to Lexi, who was still shaking. Go back to your quarters, delete the logs on your end. From here on out, I'm the only one holding the stick. I walked away into the Virginia fog. The Reaper finally stepping out of the mist. And into the light of a truth that was about to burn everything down. The Atlantic didn't just look angry, it looked murderous. Out past the Virginia Capes, the horizon had vanished into a swirling wall of charcoal gray mist and white-capped fury. This was hurricane season, the kind of weather that makes even the most seasoned sailors double-check their life vests. On the flight deck of the carrier, the wind was a physical weight, pushing against my chest, carrying the sting of salt spray and the sharp, ozone smell of an approaching electrical storm. I stood by my pave hawk, watching the flight deck crews scramble. It was supposed to be a standard live-fire rescue drill, a simulated sinking of a cargo ship to test our response times. But as I looked at the dark sky, I knew Silas Vane had stopped playing by the rules. He'd pushed this exercise into the teeth of a real-world gale, a move so reckless it bordered on criminal. He wasn't just testing us anymore. He was creating an environment where an accident wouldn't just be plausible, it would be expected. Silas was up there, perched in the primary flight control tower, watching through narrowed eyes. I could feel his gaze like a cold needle on the back of my neck. He'd assigned me a bird that had been pulled from emergency maintenance only an hour prior. The logbook said it was greenlit, but when I ran my hand along the fuselage, I felt the slight, irregular tremor in the hydraulic lines. He'd sabotaged the simulation in Chapter 5, and now he was sabotaging the reality. He wanted me out over that churning black water in a machine he knew might fail. Reaper 0, you are cleared for launch, Silas's voice crackled through my headset. It was calm, too calm, like a man watching a coin toss he'd already rigged. Falcon 2 is already on station with the SEAL team. Maintains secondary overwatch. Do not engage unless primary extraction fails. Acknowledge. Reaper 0 acknowledges, I said, my voice low and rasping. I gripped the collective, feeling the familiar, violent vibration of the rotors biting into the storm. We're moving. The takeoff was a vertical slugfest. The wind tried to swat us back down against the steel deck. But I fought it, inch by inch, until we cleared the carrier's wake. Beside me, Lexi Moore was white-knuckled, her eyes darting between the flickering instrument panel and the chaos outside the glass. We were flying into a nightmare. And the deeper we went, the more the radio filled with the frantic chatter of Falcon 2, the bird carrying the young seals. Then it happened. A jagged spear of lightning ripped through the charcoal clouds, striking the sea less than 100 yards from the lead helicopter. The EMP surge or the sheer force of the strike, something gave way. Over the comms, I heard a sickening mechanical whine followed by Lexi's choked gasp. Falcon 2 is down, they're hit, they're going into the drink. I watched it happen in slow motion. The lead bird, Lexi's friends, the young men Silas had sent out as pawns, tilted sharply to the left. Its tail rotor sheared off, and the massive machine plummeted, disappearing into a valley of black water and white foam. Command, Falcon 2 is down, I shouted into the mic, banking my bird hard toward the crash site. Requesting immediate permission to deviate and execute water recovery. There was a beat of silence. A long, agonizing pause, where only the static of the storm filled my ears. Then Silas's voice came through, cold as the depths below. Negative, Reaper 0. The sea state is above safety thresholds for your airframe. You are ordered to maintain altitude and return to the carrier. Search and rescue vessels are being diverted. Do not, I repeat, do not attempt a recovery, acknowledge. He was doing it again. The exact same move as Korengal. He was ordering me to watch them die, so he could blame the safety threshold later. He wanted to bury the truth, along with Falcon 2. Ma'am, they're dying down there, Lexi screamed, pointing at the churning water where a single strobe light was flickering against the dark waves. We have to do something. I looked at the tower, though I couldn't see Silas. I knew he was waiting for me to obey. Waiting for me to be the good soldier who followed orders into a tragedy. Negative, command, I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure, icy iron. Number 1, the Navy doesn't leave people behind. And number 2, my call sign isn't a suggestion. It's a promise. I slammed the stick forward. Reaper 0, stay at altitude, that is a direct order, Silas roared, his composure finally breaking into a frantic snarl. If you drop, I will have your wings for breakfast. Then I hope you're hungry, Silas, I whispered, cutting the comms. The descent was a freefall, through a washing machine of salt and wind. I brought the pave hawk down, until the skids were practically kissing the crests of the 20-foot swells. The spray blinded the sensors, and the wind tried to flip us like a coin. It was a maneuver they tell you is impossible in flight school, a wave touch, hover in a gale. One wrong move, one gust of wind, and the ocean would swallow us whole. Lexi, get the hoist down now. I fought the controls, every muscle in my arms screaming as I wrestled with the wind. The helicopter groaned, the engine straining against the sabotage Silas had baked into the maintenance. But the machine knew. It felt like the bird itself was fighting to stay alive, fighting for the men in the water. I saw them. Lexi was leaning out the door, her harness taut as she guided the cable down. One by one, we hauled them out of the black maw of the Atlantic. The seals were battered, freezing and terrified, but they were breathing. Lexi pulled the last man in. The son of a senator, a kid Silas had tried to use as a political sacrifice. I pulled the collective, my lungs burning, and clawed our way back into the sky just as a massive wave broke exactly where we had been hovering. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared back to life. We limped back to the carrier, the fuel light blinking red like a heartbeat. As the skids hit the deck, the silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. The deck crew, the medics, the officers, they all just stared at the battered Reaper Zero. I stepped out of the cockpit, my flight suit soaked, and my hands shaking from the adrenaline. I didn't look at the survivors. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked straight up at the tower. Silas Vane was standing there behind the glass, his face a mask of pale, frozen horror. He hadn't just lost his accident. He had lost his grip on the narrative. I pulled the encrypted drive from my pocket, the one containing the truth about his brother, and held it up toward the tower. Just for a second. A silent promise. The Atlantic hadn't taken me, and the storm was just getting started. But this time, I wasn't the one being hunted. I was the one bringing the Reaper home. The walk from the flight deck to the Admiral's office felt like a funeral procession, only I wasn't the one in the casket. My flight suit was heavy, plastered to my skin with a cocktail of Atlantic salt and cold sweat. Every step I took down those sterile, white-lit corridors left a damp trail on the floor, a mark of the storm I'd just dragged back into Silas Vane's world. The sailors I passed didn't say a word. They just stepped aside, their eyes wide with a mix of terror and something that looked a lot like reverence. They knew what had just happened out there. They'd seen a dead woman fly a ghost of a machine and beat the ocean at its own game. I reached the top floor, the air-conditioned chill of the command deck biting into my soaked shoulders. I didn't knock this time. I didn't wait for an invitation to be ignored. I simply put my shoulder to the heavy oak door and pushed. The office was dim, lit only by the rhythmic, amber flash of the harbor lights outside the window. It smelled of expensive mahogany, old tobacco, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Silas Vane was sitting behind his desk, but he wasn't the shark anymore. He looked smaller, older. He didn't look up when I entered, but his hands, those manicured, powerful hands, were gripping the edge of his desk so hard the knuckles were white. "You should have stayed at altitude, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried across the room. "You've been saying that for 8 years, Silas," I replied. I walked to the center of the room, my boots squelching on the fine rug. "But we both know that's not how it works. You don't get to tell the Reaper when to stop." I pulled the encrypted drive from my pocket and tossed it onto the desk. It skittered across the polished wood, coming to rest right next to the face-down photo of Julian. Silas flinched as if I'd thrown a live grenade. "You're done," I said, my voice low and steady, vibrating with a decade of suppressed fury. "I have the logs, I have the raw audio. I have the proof that you held Reaper Zero back while your brother begged for a green light. You sacrificed Julian to clear a ridge that didn't matter, just so you could have a cleaner headline for your promotion. And then you spent 8 years trying to bury me, so I wouldn't be the one to tell the world who the real killer was." Silas finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the predatory blue gone, replaced by a hollow, flickering desperation. "I did it for the mission," he snarled, though the venom lacked its usual sting. "In war we make choices, hard choices. Julian knew the risks, he was a soldier." "He was your brother, Silas," I shouted, the sound echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "He wasn't a choice. He was a human being who trusted you. And he died thinking he'd been abandoned by his pilot. He died thinking I was the one who didn't care." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, portable player I'd prepped. I hit the button. The static filled the room, then that young, cracking voice, Julian's voice, echoed through the Admiral's sanctuary. Silas tried to reach for the device, but I stepped forward, my shadow looming over him. Listen to it, Silas, I commanded. Listen to the man you murdered. The recording played through the gunfire and the wind, reaching those final, desperate seconds. But then, a part played that Silas had never heard, the part he deleted from the official archive. But that had remained on the raw black box telemetry. Reaper Zero, if you're listening, tell Silas, tell my brother. I saw heaven once, it was made of ice and rotor. Tell him I did my job. Tell him to find his way home. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas Vane didn't move. He didn't breathe. His eyes were fixed on the player, as if it were a ghost manifested in plastic and wire. The hold position order, the sabotage, the 8 years of slandering my name, it all collapsed in that one moment. Julian hadn't died in anger. He'd died with a mercy that Silas didn't deserve. He forgave you, Silas, I said, my voice softening, though the edge of steel remained. Long before you even thought to cover it up, he forgave you. And you've spent nearly a decade trying to destroy the only person who could deliver that message. Silas collapsed. He didn't just sit, he collapsed into his chair, his head falling into his hands. The Admiral, the legend, the King of Norfolk was gone. In his place was a broken man drowning in a storm he'd created himself. He started to sob, a dry hacking sound that didn't belong in a room this powerful. I stood there watching him. I'd spent years dreaming of this moment, imagining the satisfaction of seeing him ruined. But as I looked at him, I didn't feel the rush of victory. I just felt a profound, heavy sadness. All that wasted time. All those ruined lives. All because one man couldn't bear the weight of his own failure. I could take this to the Pentagon tomorrow, I said, gesturing to the drive. I could have you in front of a court-martial by noon. Your career would be over. Your legacy would be a stain on the Navy's history. Silas looked up, his face wet, waiting for the killing blow. But that's not what Julian would want, I continued. And that's not why I came back. I didn't come here to kill a man. I came here to stop a storm. I leaned over the desk and picked up the photograph of Julian. I flipped it over, setting it upright so the boy could finally look his brother in the eye again. Tomorrow you're going to report yourself, I said. Not for murder, but for the cover-up. You're going to request a transfer to leadership ethics. You're going to spend the rest of your career making sure no young lieutenant ever has to hear a hold position order while their brothers are dying. That is your penance. That is how you find your way home. I didn't wait for his answer. I turned and walked toward the door. I could hear him gasping behind me, the sound of a man finally breathing after being underwater for 8 years. I stepped out into the hallway, the cool air of the corridor hitting my face. Lexi Moore and a group of the SEALs I'd pulled from the water were standing there, waiting in the shadows. They didn't ask what happened. They just saw it in my eyes. I didn't feel like a reaper anymore. For the first time since the Korengal mist, the cold I'd been carrying in my chest, the Wyoming ice was starting to thaw. The past was no longer silent. It was just the past. I gripped my father's silver ring in my pocket, felt the precision of the metal against my skin. And finally, for the first time in a decade, I knew exactly where I was landing. The hearing room in Washington, D.C. didn't feel like a place of justice. It felt like a meat grinder lined with mahogany and polished brass. The air was unnaturally still, chilled by an industrial HVAC system that seemed to suck the life out of every word spoken. Light poured down from high recessed fixtures, striking the long wooden benches and turning every face pale, clinical, and judgmental. I sat in the witness chair, my dress blues crisp, the silver wings on my chest catching the light. I wasn't the grease-stained mechanic from Wyoming anymore, and I wasn't the desperate pilot from Korengal. I was Reaper Zero, and for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't the one being hunted. Across the aisle, Admiral Silas Vane sat at a small table. He looked hollow. The sharp, predatory edges of the man I'd met at Norfolk were gone, replaced by a sagging weight that no amount of gold braid could hide. He didn't look at the Board of Admirals, and he definitely didn't look at me. He just stared at his own hands, those powerful hands that had signed the orders that broke so many lives. The lead prosecutor, a man with a voice like dry gravel, laid out the evidence. He showed the discrepancies in File 204. He played the digital forensics that proved the logs had been altered. Then he reached the climax, the raw audio from the black box. When Julian's voice filled that hallowed room, cracking with the realization that he was being abandoned. A heavy, suffocating silence followed. It was the kind of silence that precedes a verdict. "Commander Thorne," the board representative said, leaning forward. "The evidence of Admiral Vane's misconduct is overwhelming. He tampered with mission records, manipulated training exercises, and most egregiously, covered up a command failure that resulted in the death of a United States serviceman. The JAG is recommending a full court-martial and a dishonorable discharge. Before we move to a formal vote, as the primary witness and the individual most affected by these actions, the board wishes to hear your recommendation." I stood up. My chair didn't screech this time. It moved with a quiet, deliberate precision. I looked at the board, men who had spent their lives climbing the same ladder as Silas. Then I looked at Silas. "We're talking about a man's legacy," I began, my voice steady, carrying a rhythm that seemed to quiet the room. "But we're also talking about the culture of command. For 8 years, I carried the weight of the Korengal Valley. Because it was easier for the Navy to blame a pilot than to look at a legend and see a mistake. I lived in the silence of Wyoming because the noise of the truth was too loud for anyone here to handle. I paused, letting the weight of those years settle in the air. But I didn't come here for revenge, I continued. Revenge is just another storm, and I'm done flying through those. If you strip Silas Vane of his rank and throw him in a brig, you're just burying another ghost. You're making him a martyr for a failed system. I don't want his medals. I don't want his pension." A murmur of confusion rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor frowned, but I didn't stop. "I recommend a different path," I said, looking straight at the board. "I recommend that Silas Vane be stripped of his command, but not his responsibility. Reassign him to the Leadership Ethics Division. Let him be the man who has to stand in front of every new lieutenant, every fresh-faced commander, and tell them exactly how he failed his brother. Let him teach them that a hold position order isn't a tactical tool, it's a moral burden. Let him spend the rest of his career ensuring that no one ever has to hear the silence I heard." The room stayed silent for a long time. Silas finally looked up. His eyes met mine, and for the first time there was no hate. There was just a profound, agonizing gratitude. He knew I was offering him something he hadn't dared to hope for, a chance at redemption. I sat back down. The hearing wasn't over, but the war was. I'd walked into that room to expose a liar, but I was leaving as something else. I'd used the truth not as a blade, but as a bridge. As we filed out of the room, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my lawyer back home. My husband had dropped his contest for the custody hearing. Seeing the news, seeing the truth of Reaper Zero, He'd finally realized he couldn't fight a woman who had survived the Atlantic and the Admiral's lies. I was going to get Maya back. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright DC sunshine. The air was warm, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'd landed. I'd finally, truly landed. And as I watched a squadron of helicopters fly in formation over the Potomac, I didn't see ghosts. I just saw the sky, limitless, clear, and finally, mercifully mine. 3 years later, the Wyoming sky looked exactly the way I remembered it. Endless, untamed, and a blue so deep it felt like you could drown in it. But the valley wasn't silent anymore. The sharp, rhythmic slap of rotor blades echoed off the granite peaks of the Tetons, a sound that used to bring me nightmares, but now felt like a heartbeat. My ranch had transformed. The old, sagging barn was gone, replaced by a state-of-the-art hangar and a flight line that served as a sanctuary for those the world had tried to ground. We called it the Ridge. It was a place for veterans to heal, a school where the scars of the past were traded for the freedom of the clouds. The air smelled of sun-warmed pine and the faint, nostalgic tang of high-grade aviation fuel. I stood on the edge of the tarmac, squinting against the golden afternoon light. Beside me, Maya was sitting on a flight cooler, her small hands mimicking the flare of a landing helicopter with a plastic toy. She looked up at me and grinned, a gap-toothed smile that made every battle I'd fought at Norfolk worth it. My husband, my ex-husband, I should say, was leaning against his truck a few yards away. We didn't share a house anymore, but we shared a daughter, and for the first time, we shared a mutual respect that didn't need a judge's signature to validate. He saw me now. Not as a risk, but as the woman who had brought the Reaper home. A dust cloud began to rise from the long gravel driveway. A modest, silver sedan pulled up, moving slowly, almost hesitantly. When the door opened, a man stepped out who looked nothing like the shark I'd met in that mahogany office. Silas Vane was older now. His hair was completely white, and the rigid, iron-rod posture of an admiral had softened into the quiet dignity of a teacher. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He wore a simple linen shirt and a pair of faded khakis, carrying a leather satchel that looked heavy with books rather than secrets. "Evelyn," he said, stopping a few feet away. His voice wasn't a bark anymore, it was a calm, steady hum. "Silas," I nodded. "You're a long way from the Pentagon." "I find the air is cleaner out here," he replied, looking up at the mountains. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a rolled-up set of blueprints. "I wanted you to see these before the official press release." The Navy approved the new rescue airframe. It's built with a reinforced secondary hydraulic system and an override that prevents command from locking the flight controls during extraction. I unrolled the paper. At the bottom of the schematic, printed in bold, black letters, was the designation, RZ-01, the Reaper. My throat tightened. Silas watched me, his eyes searching mine. "I spent my first year in the ethics division telling them about Julian," he said quietly. "I told them about you. About how a leader's ego can be more dangerous than a Category 5 storm." They listened, Evelyn. They're finally listening. I looked at the blueprints, then at the man who had once tried to destroy me. "Julian would have liked the design," I said. "He always complained about the old pave hawks being too sluggish in a crosswind." "He would have liked the name even more," Silas whispered. We stood there for a moment in a silence that was finally, mercifully, peaceful. There were no more ghosts between us. No more hold position, orders echoing in the dark. Silas had done his penance, and I had found my peace. He didn't stay long, just enough to see Maya run toward the hangar, shouting about Mama's big birds. He gave me a single, sharp nod, the salute of a man who had finally found his way home, and drove back toward the horizon. I walked over to the training bird parked on the pad, a sleek machine gleaming in the amber sunset. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my father's silver ring. It was worn thin now, the edges smoothed by years of being clutched in my fist during the darkest nights. I didn't hide it in my pocket this time. I took a thin, sturdy chain from around my neck and slid the ring onto it, then leaned down to Maya. "Here, baby," I said, fastening the chain around her neck. "This is for precision. It's so you always know exactly where you are, no matter how hard the wind blows." Maya touched the ring, her eyes wide with wonder. "Like a compass, Mama." "Exactly like a compass," I smiled. "They used to call me Reaper Zero. They used to think I was the one who brought the shadows." But as I watched the sun dip below the Tetons, painting the sky in ribbons of gold and violet, I realized they were wrong. I wasn't the Reaper of Lives. I was the Reaper of Truth, the one who gathered the broken pieces of a storm and built something that could actually fly. The Wyoming wind kicked up, a gentle breeze that smelled of coming rain and new beginnings. I took Maya's hand and walked toward the house, the sound of the evening crickets replacing the roar of the engines. Landing isn't about hitting the ground. It's about knowing you have a place to stay once the wheels stop turning. I looked back at the hangar one last time. The sky was clear. The past was quiet. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was home. The greatest storms we face aren't always found in the churning clouds or the violent gales of the ocean. They are the ones we carry within ourselves, the quiet tempests of regret, the cold shadows of pride, and the jagged fragments of a past we refuse to forgive. This journey has taught us that true leadership isn't measured by the volume of a command or the weight of a title. It is measured by the courage to be accountable and the wisdom to recognize that every person, no matter how small they seem in the grand machinery of power, carries a dignity that must never be sacrificed for a headline. Respect is the only currency that holds its value when the world goes dark. To respect someone is to see them, not as a tool, not as a variable in a calculation, but as a soul with a story. When we lose that, we lose our way. We begin to fly blind, guided only by the flicker of our own egos, until we inevitably collide with the truth. But as we have seen, even a crash doesn't have to be the end. The debris of a broken life can be the foundation for a stronger one, provided we have the humility to pick up the pieces and the grace to let others help us carry them. Forgiveness is not a sign of weakness, it is the ultimate form of precision. It is the ability to look at a wound and decide that it will no longer dictate the flight path. It is the realization that while we cannot change the direction of the wind, we can always adjust our sails. Peace is not the absence of the storm, it is the calm we find at the center of it. Knowing that we have stood for what is right, even when the air was screaming against us. In the end, we are all just trying to find our way back to a place where the silence feels like home. Thank you for being part of this incredible journey. This story reminds us that it is never too late to reclaim your wings or to change the legacy you leave behind. We would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to find the courage to stand up for your truth when the world tried to silence you? If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep bringing these powerful narratives to life. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon. And remember, no matter how long the storm lasts, the sky is always waiting for those brave enough to fly.